I started writing about film in Toronto for the local sort of free sheets, and came back to London to write a book about Sally Potter. Applied to write for Sight and Sound at the time when Kieran Corliss had just taken over as reviews editor, and it started from there. But writing about film was part of, or supposed to be part of, what I would hate to call a portfolio career, but that's the word you're supposed to use. I'm a poet, and that's my main vocational pursuit. I'm a teacher, but I also write about film, and it seemed like entering into film criticism was more accessible than entering into literary criticism and the rarefied world of the TLS, or theatre criticism, which is even more dominated by white male voices in the UK than film criticism is. One view, and this counts for filmmaking as well, is that it's an incredibly glamorous pursuit, that the main role of the film critic is to own several evening gowns, show up on red carpets, consort with glamorous celebrities, and opine about the marvellous work of their friends. And I think there are some practicing film critics who do perpetuate that myth through the way that they predominantly write about celebrity and write about mainstream film culture. And I think obviously film festivals such as Cannes perpetuate that myth in the way that they make people dress, the way that appearance is central, and in the way that press and filmmakers are supposed to consort with each other on those occasions. So it's quite hard to get people to see it, as with any kind of writing, as labour. And that goes for filmmaking as well. People don't see the minutiae of the job, they just see the glamorous result. And I think that we are in an era where being in print, being in public, has attached to it the same kind of fame that being on television or being on the radio does. So there's this association with the celebrity industry and an industry of glamour and entertainment that is quite different from ways in which critical writing were perceived in earlier centuries. So it's moved from a kind of intellectual pursuit to one that is attached to a global entertainment industry. And I feel that I need to stand against that in how I write and what I choose to write about. So I think of criticism as being advocacy, that it's a space in which I can amplify voices that aren't otherwise being amplified, whether that's critical voices that are looking at mainstream culture and saying, hang on, this isn't representative, this is leading us down a sort of narrative garden path here, or to look at films or festivals that may not have the attention and say, can we clear some space to really look at this because it's offering us an alternative? And that isn't glamorous work. I take my idea of advocacy from B. Ruby Rich, who I think has been the primary practitioner of critical advocacy, and she's someone who's also been a film funder and a programmer. So I think if you're completely committed to advocacy, you have to extend the work you do into curation, into funding as well. You can't just be a critic and say, oh, I'm an advocate, because it's a very passive form of advocacy. You're not getting the films made or seen. And I think as an advocate, my advocacy is for a particular form of engagement with cinema, one that's contextually informed, that's historically materialist, that's concerned with performance and histories of performance as well as just the auteur. So that offers a way of writing about any kind of film, whether it's something that I personally want to champion or something that I feel is an important part of the cinematic landscape, but I don't necessarily have a strong passion for. So, for example, Mad Max Fury Road, a film that I spent the last 2 weeks having protracted arguments about. I think it's important that that film exists because of the broad audience that it's addressing with some fairly basic feminist and environmental ideas. It's not a film that I'm going to clear my desk to champion. I think there are other films that need my voice more, but it's not a film that I'm going to set out to deconstruct or destroy or dismiss. So I think advocacy can work in that way as well. It can be about broadening the mainstream and championing, supporting films that are at least introducing more complex ideas or alternative characterizations. But I think there's a lot of people doing that work as critics already. So I think also part of, as someone who's not a full-time reviewer, as someone who chooses when to do film criticism, is literally a freelance, I can choose when to make my interventions and see where they're most valuable. As someone who writes for Sight and Sound, which does cover every film that is given any kind of release, I have reviewed films that I have absolutely reviewed negatively. And I think sometimes it's very important to give a negative review either to something about which there's a critical consensus. For example, Blue is the Warmest Colour, where I went out on a limb, supported by Amy Taubin, and I have to say that's an enormously important caveat, that often when I find I've had a negative reaction to a film that otherwise has critical consensus, I'll look up what Amy Taubin has written for Film Comment and go, oh, I'm not insane. I'm not alone here. And it wasn't an entirely negative review, although it did negate some other opinions. But I have reviewed both mainstream cinema that I've spoken about positively, such as Avengers Assemble, and then art house cinema, which I've had a much more critical reaction to than some other critics and reviewers. So it's not genre or mode specific, and I would never say I outright won't review that film because I know I'm not going to like it. I do tend to avoid films that are premised on femicide or violence against women for ethical reasons of my own, not because I believe they can't be good films, but because I physically don't want to watch them. So it's not a critical elitism that means you'll never find me reviewing a horror film, or almost never in Sight and Sound, but an ethical choice for myself. And that's something that's also quite difficult to explain to people who, if they don't perceive criticism as being very not vulnerable, as glamorous, they perceive it as being omnivorous. That as a critic, as a reviewer, your job is to have seen everything, the whole smorgasbord, even when that's 22 films a week, and to be able to make your discerning highlights from that long list. Obviously, I use evaluation as a teacher as well. So even though I'm not using evaluation or evaluative symbols when I'm writing for Sight and Sound, evaluation is something that I do on a daily basis and think about. I think we live in a curatorial moment, and I'm not in any way the first person to say this. So Hans Ulrich Obrist.
Could you explain what you mean by that?
Sure. Hans Ulrich Obrist has written about this, that in the art world in particular, the energy or the hierarchy of value has shifted from the artist to the curator. So we have so much information, so many possible outlets for our minds and our interests coming at us all the time, both because of capitalism and because of the digital, that power has shifted to the people who make lists for us. And you can see this very simply when you look at how social media works, whether it's the fact that Facebook has something called top stories, or that most of your Facebook top stories will be taken up with BuzzFeed 11 hottest scenes in this year's Cannes films that aren't by Gaspar Noé. You know, whatever those lists are, we look to popular media, I think, to help us navigate through the amount of information that is coming towards us. And with news journalism, that might be about navigating different sources. So, for example, The Guardian, a lot of Guardian reporting has now shifted to saying, well, this is what ISIS put out on their YouTube account, but this is what this undercover journalist in Syria is reporting on their Twitter feed. So discerning among different sources of information has become incredibly important. And as a critic, as a reviewer, I think my work fits into that. So in some settings, I do think star ratings are useful. In a pocket provision of information, something like the Guardian Guide, stars are useful. In fact, they don't use stars, so that's a terrible example. They are useful in aggregate for distributors, particularly I think for small distributors, that can allow them to negotiate with cinemas for extra weeks for films, or for more prominent first run, or for posters. So they're a form of advertising, they're a form of marketing, and that is contributory, because particularly for smaller films, art house films, documentary, anything that can help get those films noticed is really important. And I think there are smart ways of using them. So, for example, I think Jonathan Romney, Mark Kermode can both be quite smart about making the choice to make a smaller film their main film in The Observer, and have that star rating and have it be very visible. So the evaluative aspects are not just the stars, they tend to be what readers fixate on, but where a film review is positioned in a magazine. So when I argue, for example, that A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night should be a film of the month review in Sight and Sound rather than a standard film review, that's a form of evaluative rating as well, and it works implicitly on how the reader pays attention to that information. In the 1920s and 30s, in Britain, film was perceived as predominantly being a form of spectacle addressed to working class and middle class women. When Caroline Lejeune approached The Guardian about writing about film, there was not a broadsheet film critic. Film was only written about in trade papers. It was an industry. So in the same way that fashion and makeup and beauty continue to predominantly have female writers, film in the 1920s and 30s was a female pursuit, with female critics speaking to women. And it's also really telling that the two films that more or less ended Caroline Lejeune's career as a writer were Peeping Tom and Psycho, films which have a huge amount to recommend them, and I'm not going to go into that at the moment, but I think one of the things that they point to is the shift in the male auteur. So from the studio, which was producing entertainment product aimed at a broad audience that Hollywood studio heads perceived as being female, when Louis B. Mayer was first shown Steamboat Willie, which was brought to him by Frances Marion, who was the best-known female screenwriter in silent Hollywood and the first woman to win an Oscar for screenwriting, he refused to buy it because he said it had a mouse and it could cause pregnant women to miscarry. So that is the audience that Louis B. Mayer perceived for popular cinema in the silent era and moving into sound. As soon as film became associated with artistry, it became the seventh art, and the French perception of it began to affect how film was made independently in America and how it was circulated in the academy. So once film becomes an area of study through people like Andrew Sarris, male critics start to dominate. And I think that starts with Cahiers du Cinéma, and then that becomes the model. And it's incredible to me that Cahiers, which was so revolutionary in so many ways, was committed to an anti-colonial cinema, never once looked at its own gender politics. So I think we're still living with the legacy of auteurism, which is an extremely masculinist discourse that circulates around very masculinist ideas of the man of genius from the white male Enlightenment. And that also is mirrored by who we want to hear opinions from about film, and that Cahiers du Cinéma union of the critic and the filmmaker it's not as tight. We don't expect our filmmakers to become critics, nor critics to become filmmakers, but there is still a mirroring going on, and I think that is changing. I think Melissa Silverstein has a lot to do with this. It was impossible to predict when Women in Hollywood began as a blog that it would be taken up by IndieWire, that it would become a paid job for her, and that it would come to have so much international prominence, able to run campaigns which are, if not directly affecting, there's only shaping decisions taken at film festivals and at Hollywood studios. There have always been exceptional women. So whenever you say, oh, film criticism is dominated by men, people will say Pauline Kael and Susan Sontag. And these are two very well-known names who absolutely provided alternative voices at the height of auteurist cinema. And in fact, both of them embraced in different ways auteurist cinema and the emergence of the new American independence and of different waves of European art house. One of my favourite writers about film is Bell Hooks, who is probably the only well-known woman of colour writing in English about film. And she wrote for a range of magazines, including Essence and Interview, but never for any of the major film magazines or newspapers. So if you look at Marie Claire, Vogue, Cosmopolitan, those magazines have always had women writing about film, and not just writing about The Devil Wears Prada, attending all kinds of films, promoting art house cinema such as The Clouds of Sils Maria, because of a strong interest in performers, in production design, in costume. So we tend to define film critics as people writing for the major newspapers and maybe for major film magazines like Sight and Sound and Film Comment, but there's all sorts of areas of film criticism going on, not just at, say, student newspaper level, but in glossy magazines, as well as now, of course, on specialist blogs. That has an impact. It can have an impact for how films are received. In the November 2014 issue of Sight and Sound, the editor's letter, entitled The Equalizers, was a recognition that Sight and Sound did not feature prominently an equal number of female contributors. It also went some way towards recognising that the film industry itself was sexist, both in terms of production and representation, and that there was maybe some connection between critical practice and the perpetuation of what has now been recognised actually as illegal discrimination by the ACLU in the film industry. And I read this editorial as a contributor to the magazine and discussed it with a number of colleagues and friends, some of whom are contributors to the magazine and some of whom are not. And we felt that its conclusion, which was an open invitation to more women to submit, didn't go far enough into recognising the multiple barriers of structural sexism and racism. And the background for that is from an American organisation called VIDA, Women in the Literary Arts, who for the last 5 years have been performing something very simple, a count. They've been taking every literary magazine and counting how many book reviews are by women, how many are of books about women. This year they started counting, including where it was possible to recognise it, people's ethnic and national designations as well, to look at intersectional oppression. And so, informed by these figures and discussions around these figures in the literary world, I felt that Sight and Sound was only at the beginning of what they needed to do, and I entitled my response, which was signed by 80 people who write about film who identify as female, an invitation is not enough because it doesn't address the structural issues. So if I were a young female critic writing on my student newspaper, I would not necessarily look at Sight and Sound and think this is somewhere that's going to be welcoming of the way in which I want to write about the growth of the number of films by women of colour coming out of Sundance. I don't necessarily think this is going to be somewhere that's going to welcome me writing about trans cinema. And I also felt that as a prominent contributor to Sight and Sound, someone who has been critical of male auteurist films in ways that have drawn fire, and I'm happy to draw that fire, I also had a responsibility not to pull the ladder up. Amy Torbin, we asked Ruby, we asked Sophie, and they didn't want to write about it, so we're dropping it. I want to have a dozen voices at Sight and Sound that could be approached to write about Selma, and the coverage by both Miriam Bale and Ashley Clark was fantastic, but I know that they both had to fight to get that prominent coverage, and the way in which change can happen, it can be so fast. So within 2 months of Nick James's letter, Selma was on the cover of Sight and Sound, with an image of David Oyelowo, not of Ava DuVernay. Sofia Coppola remains the only female filmmaker to have appeared solo on a Sight and Sound cover. And I think we're in a moment where, because of the political forces arraigned against us, solidarity is happening. People are recognising that these struggles have not been won. We can't sit back on our laurels and say, oh, we live in a post-racial, post-gender equality, post-queer era, that people are realising those struggles have to be made at the most basic economic levels, and that they're life or death struggles, and that those of us who do have educational privilege, who have employment privilege, have to commit to them as well. And Nick is serious about that. So I think things will shift, but it's about shifting a whole culture, and that will happen really slowly, because it's the right of younger writers, of all writers, to say, well, I don't want to write for Sight and Sound, I don't want to endorse their position, and hopefully they'll see the changes that are happening and come towards the magazine. As well as working as a film journalist, I also work in digital democracy and education with organisations like English Pen, and I am an advocate for the democratisation of access to the public sphere that has been made possible by digital tools. I think digital tools are neutral. I think the problem is capitalism. So when I started blogging on LiveJournal in the 1990s because of the X-Files message board, and started within fan communities that were on independently run websites that belonged to small startups, the message of digital democracy was very strong. And I think the best analysis of what happened in the last 20 years and how we can change it comes actually from a filmmaker, Astra Taylor, documentary maker who made a film called Examined Life and also has made a couple of films with Slavoj Žižek. And her book, The People's Platform, talks about what happened to digital technology and digital media as they've become part of corporate conglomeration. So the same thing that has affected film studios, that whereas film studios were once independent, they're now very small parts of global businesses that manufacture everything. I always think of the example of the Scheinhardt wig company in 30 Rock, which now owns General Electric, which owns NBC. That has also affected both print and digital media. I think it's a very easy narrative for people who work in print and for people who run print to blame the digital. But what has happened with media conglomeration is what has affected print and allowed the digital to come in. And it's often the same company that owns both the print entity that is dwindling and the digital that is growing, and that looks at print as just a way of supplying content for the digital. I think there are spaces in which the digital remains a temporary autonomous zone, that possibility still exists. I think we always have to be wary of who owns the tools, who owns Twitter, who owns the blogging platforms, who owns the platforms we're posting film on, and to make choices where we can, to be strategic, to see them as tools for a kind of guerrilla practice. The problem comes when you start celebrating the tool itself as having achieved something. Twitter didn't achieve anything. The people who used the people who use Twitter in Tahrir Square or in Tehran or have been using it in Ferguson are the ones who've made the change, but they're just doing what protesters and artists have always done, which is working by any means necessary. So I proudly embrace the digital as someone who is a blogger, someone who champions digital film and television making by people like Desiree Akhavan and Cecile Emeke. I think it's really interesting that some of the most prominent web TV series of recent years have been by women of colour who would not have got the HBO deal that Lena Dunham has. So there are flows, but what is interesting to see is whether everyone who starts in this utopian space and is championed within a utopian discourse can make it into the realm where they're able to live securely through their work. And that generally means moving offline and into more gate-kept territory. So whether it's making TV, and obviously Netflix and Amazon are now in a nebulous zone where they are online, but they're clearly not temporary autonomous zones in any way. They are now content providers as much as BBC or HBO are, or to working with film studios. And I think there are funders who are such as Chicken and Egg, and also these new projects set up by people like Rose Byrne and Lena Dunham, production projects that are mirroring those flows from the digital into offline production, that are looking to amend that divide, but we'll see what happens. And I think the flow also goes the other way, that filmmaking now and film criticism are both completely dependent on the digital to circulate what they produce. So I don't think the distinction is hard and fast anymore either. I think that question could have been asked at any time in the last 100 years, in the same way that what future do you see for film has been asked. So innovations, every innovation, sound, colour, cinemascope, 3D, video, television, have always brought doomsaying voices as well as utopian voices. And I see myself as someone who, as a historical materialist, tries to navigate between both of those, because clearly home video had a huge impact on cinema attendance, initially dwindling attendance, but then it promoted attendance, I think, particularly for genre cinema in coming out of Hollywood. So suddenly you have the careers of Ridley Scott and Steven Spielberg being made possible in the 80s because of the video success of things like Star Wars. So digital will change, and already has changed, film criticism. that there are more gatekeepers that people will look at. I don't know how many people as viewers look at Rotten Tomatoes, or whether that's just an echo chamber in which as film critics we're always looking to see, it's like ratemyprofessor.com. Am I good enough? Am I in line? Am I included in the bulk of the conversation? Because I think the way that most people access information online now is a search engine. So whatever search engine optimized, whether that's a newspaper, a blogger, or an aggregator like Rotten Tomatoes, will be what is given the Google stamp of authority, as opposed to people necessarily associating authority or gatekeeping with a particular publication. So that is a huge change. I think people are still interested in having those avenues, whether it's to consult against their own taste and judgment after they've seen a film. So I see a lot of those conversations happening now, that people want to go to a review that's been posted online and say, well, I've just seen Mad Max Fury Road and here's my take on it. So now I think contextual conversations can happen in a much more widespread and democratic way, that it's not just one or two people possibly having their letter printed in Sight and Sound or discussing it in a classroom, that maybe film criticism is shifting to discussions after the fact, rather than helping people to discern whether to see a film or what to make of it. So I think maybe its function is shifting towards creating larger conversations, which, as more and more films are distributed through video on demand, that first run box office will become less and less important. So those conversations after the fact, where people say, well, I saw it and I thought it was brilliant, might then drive video on demand viewing, DVD sales, second run viewing, film clubs, and so on, because I think means of distribution are changing as well, and that will change film criticism. But firstness has shifted as well, that some film distributors still use embargoes, particularly for blockbuster films, but for critics who go to film festivals, the burden of firstness is enormous, and you'll see people tweeting in the films, as they're walking out of the films, as they're walking out of the films halfway through, with a determination to capture this wave of firstness, to have the first opinion, to be the person whose opinion is circulated most. And obviously that's permanent, that's indelible. And that, I think, is a major difference. Obviously, people have been reporting from film festivals as long as film festivals have been going, and then maybe changing their opinion in weekly reviews. But if you tweet about a film and your tweet is shared 1 million times, and then you come to write your review a year later, it will be very hard to say, actually, on second viewing, I think it was festival euphoria, or I think it was the 9th film I'd seen that day, and, on a second viewing, it's much more interesting. So... But I think media users are very savvy. I think there's a dominant discourse that regards the massive online users, in which I would include myself, as being extremely naive about how information is formed and circulated online. And as someone, particularly as someone who works with young people on a daily basis, they're incredibly savvy about, and I think this is a legacy of media studies education, and I just want to take a second to champion media studies and film studies A-level for giving young people an insight into literally how our world is produced, because our world is so mediatized. Every bit of politics and history is produced through information media. They know how information is being produced and regulated. They're aware of the systemic sexism and racism that might frame any opinion that is coming out. They're aware of the places they can intervene. So while that burden of firstness remains and has intensified, I think as a critic, I also feel enormously freed up by the thought that someone's immediately going to come along and be in conversation with me. And they could be coming from anywhere. They could have watched an illegal download of the film. They could be a festival programmer in another continent. They could be someone who worked on production. And that our role can move more towards conversation. And I think this takes us back to Caroline Lejeune, who wrote with a feeling that she was in conversation with her viewers, that she knew who her readers were and what they were as an audience. They were very close to her in her perception in terms of her gender, her class, her relationship to Labour, her relationship to the nation. And So film criticism may find itself breaking into niches, which is already happening, that blogs like Women in Hollywood and Shadow and Act will have some sense of who their audience is in a way that a broadsheet critic can't necessarily. But at the same time, it's diversified, because I might think I know who my audience is when I'm writing for Sight and Sound, but once that article is up online, which very little of Sight and Sound's material is, that opinion, those shares, those responses can come from anywhere. And to me, that's exciting. But I believe in democratization, and I believe in breaking down barriers and gatekeeping, you know, including around being in the majority as a film journalist because I'm white. I think that sucks as well. I'm thinking, you know, with great respect of critics like Jonathan Rosenbaum, in particular, who has always been someone who wrote for the Chicago Reader and he wrote for the Village Voice, and he now has an incredible website, who has always been someone who has thought, although the word wasn't necessarily used then, intersectionally. He's always been someone who has taken the time as an advocate to champion films that have come from voices or communities that he feels are marginalized in the film industry. So he's someone who championed Sally Potter, he championed LA Rebellion cinema. I don't think it's impossible to take that position. It's very easy to see who is the majority dominant voice in cinema. I don't think that's difficult at all. And anyone can do that. It doesn't require an enormous amount of self-reflection to say, well, it continues to be the fact that most films, particularly large budget films, are made by straight acting, white, able-bodied, cisgendered men. I can't remember which science fiction writer said it online. I will look his name up and tell you. Said that's the lowest difficulty setting. Just think of that as the lowest difficulty setting in a video game. So how can you be an ally given that you have that privilege of having moved on the lowest difficulty setting? For some people, that will be about championing genre cinemas that they feel are underrepresented. For some people, that will be about championing national cinemas that are underrepresented. And for sure, without Tony Raines, I think British cinema goers would be a lot poorer. We would have a lot less access to Asian cinema of all kinds. He's someone who championed Apichatpong Wirasethakul long before he won the Palme d'Or, and everyone suddenly understood his films and thought they were marvellous. Jeff Andrew championing Abderrahman Sissako. That it doesn't necessarily have to be that you panic and say, oh my god, I don't know how to do this, therefore I'm just going to retire and give someone else my spot. There are ways to do it really joyfully, to pick something that you really feel is valuable, while always being aware of not getting into an argument of saying, well, I champion African cinema and African cinema comes first, I don't care about films by women. That to pick up and champion one thing that is marginalized or minoritarian or is excluded is to say, I'm open to all of the axes on which things might be minoritarian or excluded. And I think it just enormously enriches, it certainly enormously enriched my film-going experience to have been introduced to, whether it's the essay film or Francophone African cinema by someone like Betty Ellison, who has long been the champion of film cinema from Africa by women. It just makes for a richer film-going experience, and people frequently complain about the homogenization of Hollywood cinema, including male critics, and they'll tend to point to that being an effect of, for example, genre. So it's blockbuster cinema that's homogenizing it. It's a particular kind of narrative, it's a particular way in which money works, it's a particular way in which celebrity works. As if there's nothing as film critics they could do about that, when actually they have a portion of the power to challenge the very homogenization that they're bemoaning. So pick a passion and go out and champion that passion, and while you're doing it, you'll discover others. You'll be asked to be on the jury of a small film festival. You might get the opportunity to curate a small film season or write for a book or catalogue, and discover that the world of cinema just keeps on going. So I think it's an exciting prospect rather than a limiting one.